It's on a rare occasion that Oceans Day falls on the day that I publish a podcast. And today, again, this year is not the day where Oceans Day actually falls on the time that I actually put out this podcast. June 8th is Oceans Day. This podcast gets published June 7th, and then I publish another one on June 9th. But regardless, it's Oceans Week. It's Oceans Day coming up. This is a week where we take the time to reflect on the oceans, and I think it's great. And normally I put together something special for this day, but the thing is I talk about the ocean all year long. And so there's really no point in sort of capitalizing on Oceans Day and Oceans Week and being like, hey, this is what we need to do for the ocean. This is what we need to do for the ocean. Because if you follow this podcast, if you subscribe to this podcast, you can hear about that 3 days a week, every week. And so I want to continue with that. But what I want to talk about today is how you can help. You're listening to this, and you might want to be like, how can I help bring about more awareness to the ocean and help people understand what we can do for the ocean? So we're going to talk about that on today's episode of How to Protect the Ocean, because it's fitting for the name. So let's get started with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And I just wanted to say Happy Oceans Week, Happy Oceans Day, which is tomorrow. If you're listening to this whenever, Happy Oceans Day. This is, like I mentioned before, this is a time where we reflect on the ocean, and maybe the way we speak, for me anyway, but the way we speak about the ocean, the way we speak up for the ocean. And a lot of people tell me, hey, what can we do to help? How do we actually protect the ocean? And the biggest thing is talk about it. On the previous episode, we had Angelo Villagomez and Anupa Sokan on the podcast to talk about discussing ocean justice and how certain voices that are a lot of the times or from people who are usually on the front lines of conservation and either benefit or get the disadvantage of the consequences of conservation on the front line, but don't get to speak and don't get to have their voices heard. They had a conference that just went up yesterday on Tuesday. And we're going to have them back on to talk about that. But they had a conference where they got to hear from people who don't normally get heard because they need to speak up for their ocean. They need to speak up and show what works for them, what doesn't work for them, share stories, maybe build upon that and build on how more of these voices can get out into the world. And I was thinking about that is how do we get those voices out? How do we get seen or heard with those voices? And this is for anybody. I think what happens is when we hear a lot about the ocean, a lot of it's the negative stuff. We often feel as though our voices aren't heard. Or even if our voices are heard, they don't do anything. And I think that's false. And I don't think that's a good way of thinking. And here's the reason why. It all depends on what your mission is. My mission when I first started my podcast was I want to change the behavior and make one person aware. So make one person and change their behavior. One person. If I can do that, then that's my goal. And the reason why I want to do that, not to say, hey, you're doing something dumb or how dare you do this or try and vilify them for holding an iPhone or driving a pickup truck or things like that. No, my goal was to be like, hey, have you heard this is what's going on in the ocean? And hey, by the way, you can help by doing this. And I think that's a really good thing. Even when you get political, you say, hey, if your vote counts, if you vote for the environment, it's not saying you have to vote for a particular party. All we're saying is be aware of what your representative is discussing and not discussing. A lot of the times, politicians do not mention the environment at all. And if they're not talking about the environment, that may not be the right candidate if you are voting with the ocean in mind or with the environment in mind. Not to say you have to vote for one particular party over another. All I'm saying is just be aware of that, right? And so if I can get somebody just to be aware of that a little bit more, maybe the politicians that get voted in on whatever party they represent are thinking about the environment a little bit more, because you're thinking about the environment a little bit more, and you want that reflected in your representative that represents federal, state, provincial, or even local elections or local government. And that's the important part. That's sort of my goal, but everybody has their own goals. And I think that's really important. And so today I want to talk about how you can help. And the way I wanted to talk about it was to help through podcasting. How can you speak up for the ocean through podcasting? Now, for those of you who are new to the podcast, Speak Up for the Ocean Blue was my old podcast name. And so I changed it recently to reflect more of what this podcast is about, just so it helps in search and things like that. And I felt it reflected it a little bit more, and it was easier to discern when somebody's looking at the podcast cover art or looking to find a new podcast. But I wanted to make sure that everybody sort of knew what it was, so I changed the name. But Speak Up for the Ocean Blue through podcasting is what I'm doing. And there's plenty of room in the space to speak up for the ocean blue. You just have to pick your niche. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about my experience podcasting, how it's affected my life, and why I think, where the state of podcasting is with the ocean, and why I think you should start a podcast. So we're going to go through that, and I think it's really important to do that, especially here around Oceans Day and Oceans Week, to say, hey, look, you may not be able to vote all the time. You may not be able to volunteer your time with an organization, but you can sit at home or sit outside and you could podcast. And I think that's really important. I think to get your voice heard and to get your voice out there and for other people to hear what you have to say, I think that's really important. I know it's scary, and I'll tell you about my experience, but I think it's important. And so some of you may have heard this before, this story of me getting into podcasting, but I'm going to share it for a lot of the people who are new, and I find it's good to update every once in a while. So why did I get started in communication in general? What I noticed was a big change in sort of how I was viewing the world and how my friends and family were viewing the world. I was, finished graduate work with marine biology. I was working in environmental consulting, and I was seeing firsthand a lot of the times that industry would kind of prop up against the environment and how that was being dealt with. Some good, some bad, some I liked, some I didn't like, but I got to see it firsthand. And so I started to, when you work, people are like, how's work? You start discussing it, and you start mentioning things like climate change and plastic pollution and, coastal development or development in general, and how it's affecting the oceans, the lakes, the rivers, the streams, all that kind of stuff. And when I talked to friends and family about it who were genuinely interested, they were just like, oh, well, I didn't know that about climate change. Is that still a thing? Like, is that a big thing going on? And this is, late 2000s. And so they're all like, is that a really big thing that's going on? I'm like, yeah, it is. It's pretty much our biggest threat. But it wasn't, being talked about back then like it is now, today. So back in the day, it wasn't really being talked about. And the Kyoto Protocol was sort of the Paris Agreement of that day. And a lot of people were just kind of crapping on it, to be honest. Nobody wanted to go, follow it. Canada had pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. It was awful. And it was just one of the signs where you're just like, okay, this is where I'm starting to realize as a young scientist that not everybody, follows the science. And so I realized that I got frustrated by how my family and friends were reacting to climate change and how they didn't know a lot about the effects of climate change. That bothered me quite a bit. And so I was like, I'm frustrated here. What's going on with the world where they can't see this like I see it? And I kind of realized, I'm like, if you look at what was being consumed at the time, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube videos, not so much YouTube videos, but Facebook and Twitter, and like blogs were huge back then. And I started to look at it, I was like, okay, so there's not a ton of information on oceans. There's a lot, but there's not a ton of information. There was room in the space to start a blog or start something. So I started a blog. because I wanted to get my voice out there. And during that time, when I actually launched, was 2011, the BP oil spill had just happened. And so I wanted to kind of get out there or I wanted to start, reporting on it. Just like I saw a lot of scientists report on it. They were doing videos through Twitter, and even though the technology wasn't there to share as many videos on Facebook and stuff, a lot of news agencies started to pick social media or science communicators that were scientists to go out and sort of show firsthand what was happening out in the Gulf of Mexico and along the shores. And so I started a blog to do that. I started a blog to kind of, prop them up, show them as, like, I came out with a program like, here are ocean leaders in the space, and I started to highlight a lot of people. And that was a really interesting way of doing things. But I wanted to write an article every day just to kind of say, hey, my goal was not to put out long content and like, I guess, quote unquote, quality content, whereas like you looking at all your sources and everything like that, because that was going to take too much time. I had a job, I had a young kids at the time, and I just couldn't keep up with that. So I started to just do like summary, like little short articles. Probably not the best at the time, and I didn't enjoy the writing all the time. I found it cumbersome. I am not a writer that makes it easy for me to fit within the time scheme. So I moved to video, and not many people were doing video at the time. It was like 2012. Not that YouTube wasn't growing; it was growing like crazy, but not a lot of ocean people were on YouTube at the time. So I started doing video just in my living room. I had my marine aquarium behind me, which some people liked, some people didn't like, and I was doing videos, and I would do like 3 stories a day, or 3 stories of video, and I would put it out and I'd try and do like, as many days as possible. And I would do it when the kids went to bed, and that was my hobby. But it was very difficult to keep up, because not only are you putting the content together, but you're also editing the content. And the videos were like 45 minutes long or 30 minutes long. It was really long for YouTube at the time. And I just couldn't kind of keep up with that. I wish I had, because I think in my YouTube sort of journey, I'd be at my podcast journey. However, I didn't. Because it was just too much time to edit the video and audio at the same time. That was the big thing. Then I was like, okay, let's go into, like, somebody put me onto podcasting, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll start listening to podcasts. So I started listening to podcasts, and I loved them. I walk my dog a lot. I now 2 dogs, but at the time I was walking my dog a lot, morning, afternoon, at night. And so I was like, okay, let's just put on a podcast and let's just listen. And so I would download a podcast and I would listen to it, all different types of genres and categories. And then I was like, okay, where are the ocean ones? How come I'm not listening to the ocean ones? And some of the ocean ones I had, and they were very well produced and they were very well done, but there weren't a lot of ocean podcasts. And I said, I think I can do this. I have a little bit of experience with video and being behind a microphone and putting myself out there. Now let's do it in a podcasting space, because it was growing. It hit a renaissance. Started in 2006, but 2011 and 2012 was like a renaissance. So I tried to start that, but to start a podcast then was very difficult compared to now. There wasn't a lot of information on it. It was a little bit more difficult to start. There was a little bit more technical knowledge needed, and I just couldn't figure it out. I'm probably not committed enough to do it, but eventually I did it. I launched a podcast. I started recording in 2014, launched a podcast in 2015, and I was scared. I had a lot of fear because science communication was not done a lot in marine biology on a big platform like that. I was afraid what people would think. And so I kind of kept it quiet. And I took a year to publish it, but I didn't promote it as much. And then I hit the conference. It was the International Marine Conservation Congress that was happening in Newfoundland that year. Somebody reached out to me through Twitter, a guy by the director of communications at the time, the guy by the name of Dr. Ed Hines Ozon, and he reached out and he said, hey, are you coming? Because I would love to set you up with some interviews to do like for the conference. And I said, yes, I am coming. And I was very surprised that he chose that as the way. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then since then, when I went to the conference, people loved the podcast. They had told me that they've been listening to the podcast, and I got a lot of confidence from that. And then since then, it kind of took off. That was in 2016. Now it's 2023. I've been doing this for 9 years, and I am like loving it. I literally fell in love with podcasting, and that's sort of the podcast fits my lifestyle, as in I can walk up, I can read an article, I can come up with an idea, and I can walk up to the microphone and I can just spit it out. And it works. It's not the best style, it's not the most produced style, but it's the style that works for me. And it seems like a lot of people have been able to do it. I'm almost at 2.5 million downloads total, which is huge for me. And so I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish. And the biggest thing is the engagement from you guys in the audience, right? From the people in the audience who are listening to this. It really makes me happy when somebody comes up and is like, I love your content. Or I've been listening to your content for a month, 6 months, a year, 2 years from the beginning. And, they're like, I don't miss an episode, or I really love this. Or they challenge me sometimes being like, hey, you didn't really do all your research on this. Maybe you should do. And sometimes they're right. And I get it. And so I wanted to make sure that, the engagement was the best part for me to be able to hear back from people. It motivates me to keep moving forward. And that's sort of what I love about podcasting. Going back to video, I probably will be going back to video a little bit more consistently in the future. I just don't know when. Things have to open up for me a little bit to do that. But that's if I could podcast all day, every day, that'd be the dream. I've done that before, but that would be the dream. If I could, do this as a living full time, that's the dream for me. And that's what I'm working for, I'm striving for. So you're going to see over the next year, sponsors coming in, some programs, actually this episode, some programs that I'm starting, and some affiliates that I'm starting or that I've been working with companies to be able to do that. And I think that's something that is important to me to sort of monetize this, but also offer you something would be important to you and fun for you. So that's probably another podcast, but let's go into what I think like the state of ocean podcasting. So there are more podcasts in the ocean niche now than ever before, which I love. A lot of the podcasts that I see out on, and I don't know all of them, but a lot of the podcasts that I see out right now are very focused on sort of marine biology education. So specific animal education, some of the research that's going on, but a lot of stuff about animals and how they work and how they do. And I love that type of stuff. I gobble that up. That's stuff I like to listen to, and it's stuff that is really cool. And there's a good contingent of people who are starting and launching podcasts and continuing with podcasts that have diverse backgrounds, not only culturally, but just from like around the world and professionally, that bring their own perspectives to the space, which is really refreshing. It's really great because, look, I'm an old white guy. I'm not the only person who does this, but I'm the old white guy, and there's a lot of middle-aged white guys. I'm middle-aged. I'm not old. I'm middle-aged. But I think there's a lot of people like me who are doing these podcasts, and it's great to see people who don't look like me bring in their own perspective. I think that's needed. I think we need to connect with everybody we can, and I think that's really important. So we're seeing more diversity come in to the podcast space, and I think that's great. And I think, to be honest, I don't think I do a good enough job on this podcast to promote a lot of the podcasts that are out there. So that's something I should probably be doing more to get you sort of listening to different podcasts, especially on the oceans. But I do think also with people who launch a podcast, when they launch podcasts, I find some of them, not all of them, but some of them are not consistent with their podcasts. And I get it. It's not easy to launch and maintain a consistent publishing sort of frequency when you have a podcast. And plus, if you have another job or you have other things that get in the way, you're not getting necessarily paid for it. It's more of a hobby or more of a sort of part of your company or part of your business. It's really hard to keep that consistency going. But the consistency is what builds the audience. When I listen to a podcast that's regularly publishing, not necessarily every day, but even if it's once a week or even if it's once a month, I subscribe to them or I follow them. And so when it downloads, I'm itching to listen to the next one, especially the ones that I really like. And so, being able to do that, I'd love to see more consistency in this space, but it also depends on, the incentive to do so. If they're making money off of it and there's more of an incentive to put more time into it, I haven't really seen a lot of people who are independent, meaning not working for an organization or a company or a government department that has a podcast, or like that is not working for one of those, that is able to do one consistently without affecting sort of their personal life. It affects my personal life because it's my hobby, but I love it, I enjoy it. But not everybody can do that, and I fully get that. But I'd love to see more consistency in some of those podcasts, especially even some of the large organizations that do this. I'd love to see more consistency in there, showing off more of their talent of people working there in the staff room, and whether they're in the field or outside the field, sharing those types of conservation stories. That would be great. I also think there needs to be more of a transfer of information among ocean podcasters. I don't know if it's just me. I do this independently. I kind of stay within my own lane. And so I don't interact a lot with other podcasters. I have reached out to some, and I haven't received anything back, which is completely fine. But I would like to see more transfer of information, helping each other out, more sort of, interview switches and things like that. I interview you, you interview me, all that kind of stuff, just that we can build on each other's audiences, not just for my sake, but for everybody else's sake as well, but also engage with each other offline to be able to share what works, what doesn't, challenges that ocean podcasters have seen and have endured, and how people can get over that. Equipment, discussing equipment, all that kind of stuff. Love to see, something like at a workshop or something during one of the, Oceans Online or something like that. Maybe that's something that's in the future that I can help plan, but love to have other people a part of that as well. So that's where I think the state of ocean, podcasts are where it is right now. I think there's a lot of growth to be had. I think there's a lot of people that can come into the space and niche down, or niche down, as Americans say. And so I'd love to see that. I'd love to see, podcasts on a variety of different species, variety of different habitats, specific conservation issues, all that kind of stuff. I would love to see that. I'd love to see smaller organizations get into the podcasting space as well, because for science and conservation, podcasting is a perfect platform. It's a perfect platform because, you can speak for a while. People are engaged for like 20, 30, 40, 50 an hour. They're ready to engage. They're ready to listen. They're ready to learn. Podcast listeners tend to want to learn about something. And I think that's something that could be really, really good for the ocean conservation and science space. So I'd love to see more people get in there and have their own sort of niche and help promote their own projects. If I were ever working for an organization like that, that'd be the first thing that I would do, is I would start a podcast and do that consistently, so that we can help, spread this, the staff, spread the greatness of the talent of the staff and the personalities and their passion about the work and the work itself. I think it's a great way to build an audience through there. Also a great way to fundraise and so forth. So I think that's, where I would like to see it grow and more people get into that space. Now, here's the question, and this is why you should grow, or why you should start a podcast. And before we get into that, I have two quick announcements. If you're listening to this at this point of the podcast, we're pretty far into the podcast right now. Over 20 minutes into the podcast. If you're still listening to this, that means you have an interest in podcasting. And so what I would like to do is say, hey, I would love to help you out with podcasting. The first thing I would like to say is that I am putting together a science communication coaching program. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to see more people get into podcasting, more people get into science communication. I've taught for Duke University in their online sort of development program about science communication and storytelling and podcasting. And so if you want to podcast and you want to launch a podcast in the next year or in the next couple of months, and you want to help, but you don't know where to start, you don't know what to do, email me. Okay, or the better yet, DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. I am going to be putting a coaching program together for podcasting, to launch a podcast for science communication. It doesn't matter if it's not oceans, it could be anything, but my goal is to help you podcast. My goal is to provide you with that help. So I haven't come up with a price. It is going to be a monthly membership, but it's going to be more of a group coaching or one-on-one. There's going to be 2 different options. And so what I want you to do is reach out to me on Instagram at how to protect the ocean, all one word. Link is going to be in the show notes, and check it out. The other thing I wanted to tell you about is if you are going to start a podcast, you have to have a host, right? And it's the easiest way to go ahead. And I've been hosting with Liberated Syndication. So Libsyn, LIBSYN.com. It's the best, it's the longest running and probably the best platform for hosting that I feel. They value privacy. They connect you to a lot of different, what they call destinations or apps like Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Pandora, all these different types of destinations or listing apps that you can think of, some in India, some around the world. You can actually be a part of that if you join Libsyn. $20 a month should be suffice. It gets you statistics. It gets you everything you need to know. It's really easy to use. I would love for you to sign up. If you do sign up, you can use my code CMPOD. CM as in Mary, pod, P-O-D. So it's CMPOD. I would love for you to sign up for that. I do get a cut, like I'm an affiliate for that. So I do get a piece of the money, like I guess I get I don't even know the amount, but I do get a piece of the money. And it's a way to help fund this podcast, but it's also a way to get you to podcast more with Libsyn. And if you join the coaching program, I can take you through Libsyn. I can show you what is, how to use it, make it easier for you so you don't have to struggle with that. So I want to get those 2 things out there. Now, why you should podcast, okay? Here's why you should podcast. 1, we need more podcasters. We need more people in science communication talking about the ocean. We need to raise more awareness, not just with your friends and family, but with a larger audience that's interested in what you want to talk about, right? I do things very generally. I talk about things that are probably in the higher, more overview of ocean conservation and ocean science, but you may have an idea of, having like mollusks or octopus or squid specifically, or coral reefs, or marine protected areas, or plastic pollution, or whatever that might be. If you are interested in starting a podcast on any of those subjects or a subject matter that you think that is going to be great, I want you to start it. And so I think that's why we need more podcasters in there, to have more niches like that. It also helps you with your communication skills. If you are, the one thing that I found for me is I've gotten more and more comfortable behind a microphone in front of people doing presentations. I figured out my voice. So I have a voice for behind the microphone or doing presentations, and I have a voice just for talking to people. It's pretty different. I didn't realize it was different until I started interviewing people, and they're like, "You have a podcast voice." It's really interesting. Having those building that skill set of communications, especially going forward into a world where communication is going to be a huge part of your job, or at least some part of your job, that's something that you can go into and build your skill set doing. So you're always building your communication skills when you're podcasting. I think that's really important. Also, something that I never realized what it would help me, but starting a podcast actually helps you get more exposure. As not necessarily an influencer, but as a content creator, as someone who enjoys their job, as someone who wants to podcast, as someone who wants to talk about the ocean, so much so they're doing it outside their regular job. They're doing it maybe as a part of the job, but on top of their other responsibilities for their job. And so having that, you end up, if you're interviewing somebody, you're networking. Right off the bat, you're communicating with somebody, you're saying, "Hey, I think you can bring this value to my podcast. I would love to interview you for my show. Would you like to come on?" When they come on, you talk to them before you press record, and you talk to them after you press record. It could be a 5-minute conversation. It could be a 20-minute conversation. It could be an hour-and-a-half conversation before and after. But by building that network and building those relationships, those professional relationships, you end up building a larger network that you don't even realize. People are like, "Oh yeah, I know Andrew," or "I know Beth," or "I know so-and-so." That will help you, just get more exposure in general. Plus, You might get job or contract opportunities thrown your way and you didn't even realize those were available. I've had job offers. I've had contract opportunities. These are things that have really helped me. I've been able to collaborate with large organizations like Pew Charitable Trust, the Blue Nature Alliance, Conservation International, RARE, all these organizations that I've always wanted to work with or be a part of, I've been able to collaborate with because of my podcast. And I think it's a great, great thing. The other thing is it will teach you about the industry. Podcasting, you get through those conversations you have with people when you're interviewing them, you get to talk to them and you get to say, hey, like, what's going on behind the scenes? You're here, oh, there's a grant coming out about this, or there's a paper coming out about this that not everybody knows about. You get privy to information, or you're allowed to be privy to information of like, hey, we should do this interview because I'm about to release a paper in a month or so. And if we do the interview the same time as the release date, it'll be perfect. And we can use that as advertisement for the paper. Or just like the conference, that Upwell conference I just helped promote. I reached out to my buddy, he was Angelo, who was talking about it and tweeting about it all the time. And I was like, hey, man, I would love to promote this on the show because I think it's really important. He's like, this is great. It's value for value. I know my audience loves this kind of stuff, and I know he wants to promote it. And so he brought in not only himself, but he brought in Anupa and unfortunately another person that couldn't make it that day. But we were able to put a nice podcast together and promote it so people could sign up and listen to it the next day. These are all things that you can do, and you have no idea that it's available because you haven't started podcasting. And it could be a podcast. It could be a YouTube channel. It could be something on Instagram. It could be a TikTok account. It doesn't matter. What matters is you do it consistently and you come up with a plan to put it together. So that's why I think you should podcast. And there are a couple of ways that I can help you do that. One is join my communication coaching program, right? We will start and launch a podcast for you or a channel for you or something. We will work together to start that. If you want to be a part of that, just reach out to me at How to Protect an Ocean at How to Protect the Ocean, all one word, at How to Protect the Ocean. Link is in the show notes. And if you want to start podcasting and you don't need my help, or you want to get started before you start getting my help, go to libsyn.com, Libsyn. And when you pick a plan, I recommend the $20 plan. Pick a plan and put in the code CM as in Mary, POD, CM Pod, CM POD into the checkout, and that'll help. I get an affiliate. It'll help me support this podcast, but it'll also help you. I'll help you set up your account and everything like that. I think it's really important. So, especially if you join the communication coaching program. So that's it for today's episode. I want to wish you a happy Oceans Day, a happy Oceans Week. Of course, it's always Oceans Day and Oceans Week, Oceans Month, Ocean Year when you're here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, because we love to talk about the ocean. But I want to thank you so much for indulging me in this program, indulging me in this podcast, listening to it, offering advice, gratitude, all that kind of stuff. I really do appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to doing another year of podcasting and more, many more. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.